They told me to write this down because memories fade and paper keeps what faces cannot. They told me that a paper can be burned and a truth still lived inside a man. But perhaps if the truth is written plainly enough, someone, somewhere, will believe a voice that has been mostly silent for 60 years. I do not expect proof. I do not ask for medals. I want only one thing, that the shape of what we met in that green dark not be swallowed by convenient blanks in other men's reports. Call it what you will, monster, guardian, animal, thing of the island. Call it by the bureaucratic names the commanders used afterward, locale anomaly, operational anomaly, enemy action, and you will still have missed the way it watched us. What U.S. forces uncovered during a silent radar outage was classified, the rumor says. I can tell you why they had reason to call it that. I write as a man older than the island that took my comrades. My hands have trembled with age the way they trembled with heat before the first attack. My name is unimportant. What matters is the path from Lunga Point into the interior and back out again with too few men at my side. If anything in this paper sounds like an accusation, understand it is only a man trying to place his grief in order. We arrived at Lunga Point in late May 1942. The ships lay like iron teeth against the bay, and the air was thick with gasoline and salt. Our orders were simple, and at that hour, proud. We were to clear and build, to make space for the runways the High Command hoped would bring us advantage in the Pacific. Airstrip once, then air dominance, the paper said. For men who had spent months on corvettes and transports, the earth beneath our boots felt like a promise. The island itself was a slow green fever. Palms leaned over the water like tired sentries. The jungle beyond the beaches hung heavy with smell, rotting leaves, salt, and something sour that settled in the back of the throat when the wind changed. At Lunga, the beach was a brief plain of activity, tents being raised, stores counted out, drunk and laughing maintenance crews waking to change a generator belt. Up the ridge, the jungle was immediate and thick. We never saw clearings that promised villages. The islanders we met were few and kept their distance. They watched us with an old, bright worry and spoke in words our interpreter shaped into softer phrases. "These hills are not empty," said an old man named Kalani, small and black-eyed, who came once to the supply lines with a woven basket of yams to trade. He put his palms together the way islanders do and said, slowly, each syllable like a stone, "There are tall ones. They live under the sky." Our lieutenant smiled as if the old man told us a children's tale. The sergeant shrugged and said, "Jungle stories. Keep them away from the cooks." My comrades laughed. We blamed the long voyage and the boredom we expected. A man goes mad if he has only his uniform for company.
The sergeant was a broad-shouldered man named Ito. He wore his hair short, kept his boots polished, and had the old soldier's way of making men feel steady simply by presence. He had seen campaigns on other islands. He had a mouth that told jokes and a back that could carry a radio set without complaint. Lieutenant Hayashi was younger, with a map case habitually under his arm, eyes bright with plans and charts. Hayashi loved the geometry of strategy, the way boys love puzzles. Lines and squares to mark positions and intersections, the neat lick of ink on tracing paper. He believed orders could be obeyed and wars can be organized as if they were sums on ledgers. We needed both of them in the first days. Ito's steadiness to keep men from melting into the humid afternoons, Hayashi's faith to plan the airstrip where the mud liked to swallow wooden rails. We began with small victories, cleared a patch big enough for a cleared runway frame, set poles, drove pickets into soil that smelled of rot. Each night we returned to a sentinel world of fires and distant insect cries. Each night some man cracked open a can, showed pictures from home, talked too loud to drown the feeling that the jungle was listening. Then we began to find tracks. The first were simple depressions in the dust, but far larger than any man's foot. At first we thought of elephants. No island elephants, of course, but in the first confusion a man will name what he knows. The prints were long and had an arch like a hand. They were deep enough that when the rain came they would hold water like little wells. On the edge of a path a patrol came upon chopped grass, stalks bent and torn in a manner that implied force, not claws. Later that week, a dog of the unit that had been purchased on the mainland and brought aboard the transports went missing. In the dawn, we found only its collar, its fur plucked out in wide strips, as if some drunken god had run a hand through it. Our lieutenant insisted on a name for every unknown. "Animal," he said, "a large predator. We will not yield ground to superstition." The sergeant only scowled and told men to keep watch. It was on a reconnaissance patrol that men found the body in the trees. We were moving a small party along a game trail toward a ridge when Sato, one of our more quiet men, stopped and pointed. He lowered himself to his knees and said, "It hangs." We did not go closer at first because the jungle has the habit of offering surprises that want only the quick to see them. The body was hung from vine and branch, as if some child had been strung up to dry. It was not broken as that might suggest a fall. Instead, it was torn, the torso opened, and the limbs bent at wrong angles that made my stomach climb into my throat. Something had used the man as a display. We found print prints about the tree, larger than any I knew, with what could have been toes, but also a thumb-like indentation on the inner side, as if the foot could grasp.
The men around me whispered, and the lieutenant's jaw worked. He said softly, "We do not know what we face. We must be cautious." When we came back to camp, the cook stared at the empty skillet and said nothing. The old islander, Kalani, sent an elder boy with a small wooden carving, a figure with long arms, to the lieutenant. He would not meet our eyes. "Keep lights at night," Ito told us. "Do not stray alone. If this is an animal, it is clever." The battalion wrote in its log, "Patrol found remains, probable hostile action, recommend increased night watch." The phrase "probable hostile action" would hang in other files afterward like a polite suffocation. There was a silence after that discovery that the jungle prolongs like a held breath. Men who had laughed at island tales now plotted watches and spoke in short sentences. We set tripwires and hung tins. We posted men with rifles on the perimeter and set machine guns in arc to cover approaches we thought likely. At the center of our camp, the radio still hummed, a dull insect noise, as if the conversation of the world went on and we were inside a trapped jar. Our radio operator, a young man with a missing front tooth who called himself Watanabe, became our small god. He could call supplies, call for medical help, call the ships to bring oil drums and nails. We depended on the whisper of his device. It was 3 nights after the body in the tree when the first full attack came. The night had the clean, deceptive quality of a sky that has decided to let men sleep. The moon was thin, a bright breath over the palms. We had said double watch. Men do not feel brave at night when a man they know becomes a nameless object in a tree. Ito sat with his back to a palm, chewing a toothpick and listening with the bored attention of a man who has heard 1,000 false alarms. My own rifle rested against my folded knee like a familiar animal. Someone had started a small fire. We traded soft jokes. Hayashi spoke of the runway and the way the dust would pack in a month. We felt small and brave and close. Then we smelled it. A copper, sweet smell that cut through the smoke and the salt. The odor of old iron warmed in the sun. It was not the smell of a rifle barrel, but of something dead and turned over. Dogs elsewhere in the camp began to whine. A breeze moved the leaves, and then, more striking than sound, the jungle went unaccountably quiet. Insects everywhere went mute as if been told to stop. The silence arrived like an animal's decision to sit at the lip of a cave and listen. We saw it first as shadow. There was a movement on the fern line beyond the perimeter. At first we thought of a man crouching, some clever scout with a torch. Then the shadow stood and filled like a dark mountain. The thing that came was tall, impossibly tall, easily 10, maybe 13 feet. It carried a club, a rough, heavy thing that had been split from a trunk and sharpened with flint. Its arms were long enough that the club swung almost at knee level. It walked upright in a way that insulted the idea of beast and called instead to memory of something that had been carved in stone to scare children. It had a head that was not human and not animal. 2 small bevels where eyes might be set, burned with a pale, focused light. Its mouth was a flush of wet darkness. I remember the way its shoulders moved, the motion of a man but broader, a swing that put height into the air. It did not roar or cry. It moved like a tide. The first gunfire was an imitation of hope. Men screamed, then the world erupted, rifle reports knocked together like stones. We fired into its chest and the rounds made little more than a soft ingrain on the hide. It raised its club and struck a machine gunner across the emplacement as if it were a child smashing a jar. The man flew back and lay still, a line of red in the sand. Another of our men tried to run. The creature caught him by the shoulder with that hand, an enormous palm closing like a trap, and the man's bones made a small, useless sound. It put him aside like a toy. We did not have time to know fear. It was bigger than that. Fear is a slow thing that allows a man to calculate.
This was immediate unmaking. The thing did not simply kill, it displayed. It hung men like trophies sometimes, laid bodies deliberately on exposed roots as if to send a message. In the quarter hour that followed, the camp was a theater of breaking branches and small, ragged screams. 4 men died that night. 2 more would not wake. We did what men do when their bones forget courage. We fled. Running through narrow jungle meant silence ruined by the slap of feet and the breathing of men like animals. We left tents ablaze, food stores opened and scattered, the radio left on its stand, still spitting static like a wounded thing. We ran until the palms closed and the path narrowed into a channel of green so dense my shoulders scraped leaves. I remember the taste of salt and iron and the sound of my own teeth chattering when my mind tried to close around what I had seen. At the ridge, we stopped and sat because we could not run any further. We had lost Sato, and not one of us could say where. He was simply not with us. Ito's jaw had become a line of stone. Hayashi sat, hands in his hair, and at one point he laughed, a thin friction laugh, and said, "What do you name a thing that is older than the maps?" No man answered. The jungle beyond remained indifferent. We made a decision then to move inland and find cover in the hills, hoping that the dense undergrowth would make the giant's arms less useful. Ito insisted that we keep a compass heading and ration our steps. We had no clear plan beyond living long enough to have one. We moved at night to keep from being seen in the thin light that water and sky could reveal. Men walked by touch. We used our hands on trunks and roots to guide us.
Sometimes I would close my eyes and feel the earth as if it could tell me where footsteps were safe. On the 3rd night of our flight, we came upon a cave. It was not a cave worth a song, just a seam of shadow in the base of a low hill where a river of water had once pushed through loose rock. We squeezed into it in a line, the cave's mouth a small slit through which moonlight made the dust fly like motes. Inside, we found the bones of rats and the smell of damp. Ito knew the value of small things and signaled for 2 men to keep watch near the entrance. We wrapped ourselves in blankets and tried to sleep with our rifles in our arms. The radio had darkened. Watanabe had tried to keep it alive, fiddling with valves and switches in the days before the attack, but the set had been left behind on a collapsed stand near the cooking fire. In the cave, we had nothing but whispered voices. The young man with the missing tooth tried to tell stories to make the shadows less angry. I remember how, at one point, some man lifted his head and said, "If this reaches the command, what will they say?" The silence that night answered nothing. It was dawn when 3 of us went out to find water. The jungle had softened in the light. The trail we followed was a narrow line of crushed ferns. There, half hidden under a fern, we found metal, an American packing crate, its paint flaking like old skin. Someone had broken it open and left contents scattered: canned food, a damp blanket, and a small notebook. I had learned how to read their characters by then, rough Roman letters in blocky hand, and I picked up the notebook because paper calls to men, like the ocean calls to the thirsty. Inside, among other notations, we found a short log entry scrawled in hurried lines. It was not in English the way I read it. A man in our group translated it clumsily. But the words we understood were blank, no returns, 0312 to 0547, and a string of letters that didn't mean anything to us, redacted. The man who had written it had underlined no returns, and had written below it a small notation: possible interference, recommend engineering inspect. On the back of the page, someone had drawn a quick map: Lunga Bay, a small dot for Henderson Field, a line of small crosses along the interior. The rest of the note had been smeared, as if someone had tried to rub out what they'd written. I do not pretend that a paper in the jungle is the same as a full account, but even in that crude log there was the sense that someone had looked at the world and found the radar gone. No returns. That phrase sits in my memory with a bruised weight. It is a line that split what was to come. If no one saw us, then no one could say we had been overwhelmed by the thing that moved like a man and used as intelligence. If instruments went blind, then the lines that men draw around their battles can be left with mistakes. Later, after the war, I learned that Allied control posts recorded a silent window that matched the hours noted crudely in that notebook. I learned this from rumor, and from the way colonels at both sides rewrote their casualty lists into forms with neat, sterile phrases. In the cave, we had only the little English paper, and the knowledge that men with different flags found the same blank sky at the same time. That morning, back in the cave, we argued.
Hariyashi wanted to go directly to the American garrison at the airfield and speak with their commanding officer. "If the enemy out here is not the Americans, then we should tell them," he said. "The island is not ours alone to die on." Ito said quietly, "The Americans will shoot us at first. They will have no immediate trust." He weighed the words like stones. We needed supplies. We needed numbers. We needed to know if the phenomenon we had seen was a reason to fight or to run. We also had to face the possibility that no official record would match our vision. A radar that ceases to tell men about movement is a gap that many hands can fill with what they prefer. A commander might call losses enemy action to keep morale. A dispatch writer might reduce the truth to a few lines, so his handwriting will fit the form. The thing that watched the jungle did not negotiate with forms. We decided to move toward the airfield for two reasons. There would be supplies there, and because if men in a different uniform had seen the same blank on their instruments, they might be less certain of who or what we were. The plan was dangerous and simple. Travel by night, skirt the coast, and approach the garrison under the pretense of surrender if necessary. We made the choice not because it promised safety, but because it was, in that moment, an action with a direction. Before we left the cave, Ito called us together and gave us a small story of a man he had once known in a mountainous campaign. He says there are times the world will ask you to do a thing, not because it is wise, but because it is what a man owes the dead, he said. We owe the dead the chance that someone will know how they died. Men who have looked into a face twisted by unknown weapons do not have many comforts. We packed the little of value we had, a length of cord, a couple of tins, maps that Hariyashi still kept like prayers. We moved that night with the patience of men who had been taught to be quiet. The jungle was a beast that crawled with small life. Our boots found the soft places and avoided the brittle ones. From time to time we would stop in dicks of fern and listen to the air like a man holding his breath. Once I thought I heard a club's heavy thump far off, and our hearts all lugged themselves into our throats. We walked until the moon rose and then melted, and finally we saw a dim smear of light in the distance where the bay met the sky, and beyond it the faint silhouette of structures that could mean help.
We had not gone far before signs of other men appeared. A cigarette butt, a boot print of a different sole, a piece of American webbing snagged on a branch. The smell of smoke, and surprisingly, the scent of cooking meat, left us hopeful and wary in the same heartbeat. Into that thin hope, the world slid another small, ugly piece, a crude stake driven into a tree with a note pinned beneath a stone. The note was in English. Our interpreter read it aloud. Warning: stay out of interior. Giant tracks. No returns on radar. Evacuate when possible. HL. HL, the interpreter said. He did not know who HL was, but the initials at the bottom of scrawled English had the effect of a signed confession. No returns on radar. The phrase sat there like a repeating drumbeat. For a moment, all the men's eyes turned to me, to realize that the world we had left behind on the other side of the bay was watching a blank place at the same time we were being watched. We folded the note into our jacket like a talisman. Hayashi kept it in the place where he kept his optimism. Ito kept his face as if wind could not change it. I remember standing and looking at the thin light off the bay, and thinking then that we were not alone in understanding some wrongness. Someone else, under a different flag, had written the same phrase. A faint, natural alliance grew in us at that edge of the island. If the instruments of the men across the bay had been fitless, then there could be an honest conversation about what the island contained, and what the men from both gangs, ours and theirs, would do to survive it. We were exhausted. We were also, beneath the exhaustion, furious that the maps and orders that had sent us here had not named the danger that breathed inside the green. We skirted the swamp and found a track that led near the airstrip. The land opened, and ahead were the sharp silhouettes of tents and the hum of activity. We had not decided if we should show ourselves or try to remain hidden until morning. The men looked to Ito. Hayashi looked to me because I had a face that was plain and knew how to speak soft with a foreign tongue. It was then that a small white object trailed away from a tent, a sheet of paper, a logbook page perhaps caught by wind, and it danced across the dirt and stopped at my boot. I bent and picked it up. At the top of the page in a neat hand were the words, Command Log, Henderson Field, 03 August 1942. Below that, a stamped time and a line of notes. I read aloud as best I could. 0312, 0345. Radar control notes show intermittent returns. 0345, 0547. No returns. Multiple ground observation reports of unusual tracks and interior. Recommend field engineers investigate.
The bottom of the page was blacked out in horizontal strokes, as if ink had been dragged to obscure the rest of the sentence. We looked at each other, the note between us like a small candle.
If the log was true, and a torn page on the ground rarely lies, then someone at the airfield had watched their screens go dead in the very hours when our camp had been torn apart and men had hung like offerings. If instruments slept, a whole set of witnesses could be made blind. If no one could say there was an attack with confidence because their machines had been silent, a command might find it easier to tidy the story into categories useful for war. That night, as we crouched near a clump of pandanus and listened to the soft breathing of men who had lost more than sleep, a thought crossed my mind. A blank on a machine is a space that can be filled with whatever explanation your hand prefers. You can call a thing a storm, or mechanical failure, or cowardice. You can choose to say enemy action and draw arrows on maps that will never ask why. The men who write reports have the power to erase the shape of a thing simply by giving it another name. We did not yet know who would name it what. We only knew the thing that had come in the night and the blank that arrived in the sky above it. The two were joined in the small notes left and half torn, and in the faces of men who had little left but stubbornness. Ito made the choice for us then. We speak to them at dawn, he said. If they shoot, we meet death on common terms. If they do not, perhaps men who do not pretend to be gods will listen. Hayashi folded his hands as if in prayer and said, "We will explain everything." And so we waited for daylight with our rifles pressed to our knees, for each of us to be ready to cross the line between uniforms and speak with men who, until this morning, had been as strange to us as the islanders. I do not know now whether that moment was courage or madness. I only know that it led to a meeting none of us had planned, and to a second kind of terror that used not only muscle, but a patience and cunning that men had not expected. The airfield, when morning broke, hummed with the noise of men who mended planes and drank coffee. The Americans moved like a separate ocean of motion, loud, quick, and efficient, and when we stepped into their light, our uniforms looked both familiar and charged with the electricity of immediate danger. A Marine lieutenant with a cigarette cut short in his mouth looked at us the way a man looks at an odd animal. He had a face that had been in too many storms and had not been surprised into gentleness. We could see a dozen rifles and a machine gun nest behind him, and for a breath of a second I thought no one would listen. Then Ito spoke, and his voice, graveled and straight, told what had happened to our camp. The young lieutenant's hand curled, and the cigarette fell to the dirt. We were led to a tent that smelled of canvas and oil, and the odd sterile tang of maps. Inside, a sergeant took notes and asked the same sorts of questions instructions always ask: names, numbers, approximate times.
Hayashi told them the story in a way a man tells of geometry, paths, times, the size of the footprints. I watched the Marine lieutenant's eyebrows knit as he looked at the notebook, and then the face of the sergeant changed to an expression I had seen in men who read something that did not fit their chart. Outside the tent as we spoke, the world unfolded with a quiet that suggested nerves. A radio operator sat nearby. He tuned his set in that way technicians have, hands quick, eyes on dials that whisper in the small speech of electrons. For a moment none of us noticed, until the man at the radio's face fell slack, and he tapped the dial harder. He muttered to himself, then wrote down a line and handed it to the lieutenant. The page read, in cramped English, 0305, no returns. Engineering to inspect. Logs flagged. The lieutenant crumpled it in his hand like a man who had been given both prophecy and pain. "We'll inspect," he said. "But we've had... this is new." The words, "this is new," were like a blade. The idea that a man's machine, made by hands and wires, could have closed its eyes at the moment men died, suggested something that could not be easily named or explained away with bravery. That the note had been flagged, some small sign that a commander had thought the event required attention, made me think that at least someone had seen the blank and treated it like a wound worth binding. We were offered sendings and a guarded escort to the perimeter to gather the missing. The lieutenant spoke of forms and claimed the men would be registered as casualties. He measured us as if reading lines on palms. When we left the tent with a small contingent, the Marine lieutenant gave Ito a look that was not wholly unfriendly and said, "Strange things live here." His voice had no mockery. He had seen the blank too. As we moved away from the airfield's ordered bustle,
we did not yet know that the words we would hand to commanders could be knotted into other forms. That night, after the tentative meeting, a small paper note was slid into Ito's hand by a man in the tent, a clerk with eyes that had watched too many bodies. On it was a single sentence in block English. Flagged events will be kept internal pending assessment. Sensitive operational loss. Under that sentence, someone had drawn a heavy black line, as if to close it. We had no choice then but to carry those black lines in our memory and the shape of the giant in our eyes. The island kept its secrets tight, and men with radios could make some secrets official. Whether through fear of panic, of operational embarrassment, or for reasons I cannot name without guessing at the minds of men long gone, the language of the powerful had ways to swallow awkward truths. We slept that night on the lee of the airfield, keeping our backs to the ordered rows of tents. In the small hours, a wind rustled through the palms and carried a sound like distant drums.
In the morning, we would be ordered to await transport or to be taken to a processing tent. We thought then that the worst of what we had faced was behind us. We were wrong. The next attack came in a pattern that suggested thought rather than hunger. It tested our weapons like a patient that probes a man's defenses to find where weakness lies. We watched men with uniforms different from ours die. We watched things hang like signs on trees. We saw how, in that assault, the island used darkness as a way of moving men like pieces on a board. Our small hope of aching conversation with another human soul would be pushed to the edge of a blood-bothered limit when the perimeter collapsed in less than an hour. We had witnessed the way the world can take a blank on an instrument and fold it into a tidy report. The shape of that folding was beginning, even then, to taste of paper and erasure. We could not know then how the pages would be shortened, how phrases like no returns would be softened and put inside forms that would say less than the night required. We only knew we had to make our next steps cheerful. We had to go from men who would run to men who would speak truth to the kind of ledger that can lie inside a neat stamp. Ito gathered the men before dawn. He looked at us all, the ones who had been barely kept together by will, and said, "We will go with them to their camp. We will ask only for a record and a look that is not a closed door." He said it as a man might say a prayer. We packed what little remained and walked toward the place where the tents made the orderly world. The island watched us go, leaves brushing like the fingers of old gods. I do not know if a man can be brave by will alone. I only know that sometimes, pushed by hunger and by the memory of a friend hung like a sign in the trees, a man finds courage and steps into daylight. We stepped, and the island answered with a silence that had teeth. We stepped, and the island answered with a silence that had teeth. The ordered world of the airfield offered a strange comfort at first, tents with numbered flaps, men moving like gears, the smell of aviation fuel and coffee. We were led to a large canvas that smelled of oil and tobacco, where a colonel, older than the lieutenant who had first taken us in, face set as if he had been carved from chalk, listened without interruption while Ito spoke again. Ito's voice did not tremble, it cut as if he were cutting rope. He told of the nights and the body in the trees, of the prince with thumbs, of the club that swung like a knave, of the taste of mel in the air. Hayashi drew the map he carried and showed the colonel how our route bent inland like a bruise. I watched their faces. The colonel's expression moved through surprise to a slow, measured gravity. He did not dismiss us. "I have orders to keep Henderson functional," he said in careful Japanese, as the interpreter turned his words.
But if there is a threat inside the island, the base must know. We will inspect. There was a kindness in the statement that did not deny duty. The colonel's eyes lingered on Hayashi's map as if considering the geometry of two armature lines, runway and jungle. The engineers were brought in with their instruments. They wore the impatient, nervous face of men whose lives are the hum of dials and the comfort of numbers. One of them, a thin American with a cigarette stub and hands stained the color of solder, pulled open a crate of instruments and set a meter beside the radar console. He spoke to his radio operator in quick terms, and then looked at us like a man who had found a shard of an ancient coin. "It isn't just a blackout," he told the colonel and the interpreter. "The returns stop, and at the same time, there's what looks like a smear across the spectrum. It's not lightning, the timing's wrong. It sits across frequencies like..." He searched for the right word and used one that belonged more to war than weather, like a thick thing in the air. The colonel nodded and asked questions the way a man checks the locks on a door, methodically, quietly. He requested log printouts. The radio operator brought out a small paper roll, crisp military paper, the kind that remembers the hand that feeds it. They unrolled it and read in fragments. There it was, The same terse line we had seen in the torn notebook. 0312-20547. No returns. Interference suspected. Engineering to investigate. Beneath the line, a neat hand had placed a checked box. Later, in another pen, the words flagged, sensitive had been underlined twice. We watched men who trusted instruments lower their heads as if to pray to the dials. The thin engineer traced a loop on the log and said, if the radar went blind for over 2 hours in the early morning, and that window matches reported ground incidents, then our records will show a discontinuity. We have to treat that as an operational anomaly until proven otherwise. Operational anomaly, repeated the colonel, the way one says a name meant to contain a thing. We will inventory losses and secure perimeter. Any additional field reports, collect them. He looked then at Ito and said, you and your men will be temporarily under shore guard. We will move with you into the interior in daylight. That decision, simple, ordered, held the shape of something hopeful and naive. Men who plan with maps and compasses imagine that daylight makes all hazards legible. The island had proved otherwise. Before dawn the next day, a small American patrol left the strip under a soft sky. They moved with a quick, practiced sound, boots that knew how to pick the wrong leaf without breaking it, and the tight, efficient speech of men used to the shorthand of command.
The lieutenant we had met, his face older than his years, took 2 men and crossed the channel of palms, and we followed with the trembling dignity of men who had fled a ghost and wanted paper to remember it by. Ito walked with his jaw set to a line of rock. We found signs almost immediately. Where the undergrowth thickened, the ground was gouged by great feet. We found the tree where the first man had hung in our camp and saw fresh marks, a shoulder muscle torn away, and a neat sweep where something had pulled branches flat as if to make a better display. Hayashi dropped to his knees and ran a hand over the leaves like a man feeling the edge of a new wound. The American lieutenant watched, pale and serious. He said quietly, we've had reports too. Our crews saw tracks on the ridge 2 nights ago. Men missing. We thought, he swallowed, we thought jungle brigandry. But your description, he looked up, and the moonlight had gone out of his eyes. On the edge of the perimeter, the engineer knelt by a battered steel housing where the radar's receivers were kept. He pried it open and showed us the inside. Wires looped like sleep, diodes blackened with heat, and on a small paper roll a pattern of blips, and then an even flatness. He held the roll tightly between his fingers, as if the paper might otherwise blow away. This could be sabotage, he said, but nothing else fits the pattern. Sabotage would be local and quick. This is like a hand passing over a lantern. And he stopped and looked at the trees. We have to assume an environmental cause until we know otherwise. His lips did not quite manage the lie of it. Men who live by instruments know when their tools have told them something the heart cannot explain. We pressed on towards a garrison some 3 kilometers inland where a larger contingent of troops and a mortar battery had been established. The land rose and opened into a basin, and the air smelled of wet earth and the copper edge of something rotten. On the approach, we found a small American patrol huddled in a scatter of tents, faces ashen. They had been on sentry the night before and spoke in short, frightened phrases. It's not only one of the Marines said. It's like, he searched for words and used the only one that felt like a map. It moves and learns. Night after night, it's different. It cuts where the wire is, walks into the least defended spot, and it brings men out like the tide. Word spread then through the garrison in the manner of noise that will not be stopped. Giant, no returns on radar, flagged, sensitive. A colonel from the other side of the island arrived, a hard man with creased features, and he did a thing that men of rank do when a problem exceeds the scale of their forms. He gathered the facts and attempted to temper them with a plan. That plan came too late.
The first full assault on the garrison began at dusk 2 days later, and it arrived with the careful patience of a thing that had learned the mathematics of our defense. It began with the lights, wires cut at their base, so that the ring of lamps around the perimeter died as if struck by invisible hands. Men at the observation posts spoke into phones that came alive with static, and then flat silence. The radios, those small idols we trusted, breathed and then went dumb. The air seemed to compress. We had fortified the perimeter with what we could: logs, sandbags, a tangle of barbed wire that made an ugly crown. Machine guns squatted like metal beasts. The Marines and the Japanese soldiers exchanged quick glances, the kind that are agreements more by need than by trust. Ito took a position with a Browning beside him, his mouth set to a line that might have been some kind of prayer. At first, the attack was a probe. Pairs of deep shadows moved along the outer trees, testing the light and the wire, and then pulling back. We fired into the black, and there was no shape that did not return like a proverb. The bullets thudded into hide and shaved sound from the air. The giants did not charge alone. They came with a patient arithmetic. One would strike a wire at a low point, and the other would come through where the wire had sagged. They did not roar to frighten. They used silence like a tool. They knew the layout. They walked to the emplacements where the guns had the least arc. They smashed tripod legs with wooden clubs that splintered like old bones, and they took men with hands that had the cruel cleverness of a person. Where a bunker's embrasure offered protection, they rolled logs onto it like a tide, and then smashed the metal with something hard and blunted. Mortars fired, and I felt the vibration like a hand that pushed into my chest, but the giants moved in such a way that the concussion seemed to turn away from them and settle into the earth. We fought like men who had seen too many things end and wanted this one to mean. The Americans squeezed the trigger until their fingers blistered, and the Japanese staggered and found new positions. For a time we held in what can only be called a liar's victory. The giants fell back as if to gather. We counted our lucky breaths and tried to imagine that the night had been written down plain enough that other men could read it. The retreat was the deception's knife. At around midnight, they came through a low ridge we had thought impassable. The clubbed logs had been set like stepping stones, and they poured through as if the earth itself had been made to slide. That hour was when the perimeter collapsed. A machine gun nest found itself without a gunner. A sentry was carried away like a small bag. The line shrank and then unraveled. I saw the colonel give an order that hung in the air like paper, and then another man took it up, and the world contracted to the last sensible thing, not to be taken alive.
I lost 2 more men that night, and I saw one of the Marines, a boy with a freckled nose and a laugh that had seemed too young for his face, bring down a club with the last of his strength and fall beside his fallen man as if sleep had found him. We tried to drag men to the landing area where the ships might take survivors, and every step there was the heat of panic. Smoke rose like a black thumb, and somewhere a plane on the strip took off and then crashed in a small, indifferent white. It was in the ruin that an odd thing happened. A small party of American Marines and my band, ragged and smelling of smoke, found ourselves barricaded together in the lee of a fuel dump. A temporary truce was a small miracle. A lieutenant, Henderson's man, unrolled a blanket and offered us coffee that tasted like burnt metal and kindness. We shared cigarettes in silence and looked at one another's faces as if comparing 2 different languages and finding the same wounds. "We're not enemies here," he said at last, with the thin smile of a man who had had his life turned into rubble. "We're survivors." We worked together then in the graceless art of survival, giving morphine to the worst of the wounded, handing ammunition across barriers, dragging men into dugouts, and covering them with canvas. At dusk the following day, a destroyer took position off the beach, and its boats began the slow, terrifying business of taking men away. The list of those who would leave was not designed by a human hand. It was decided by who could crawl and who could not. We watched the shore slide away, and the island fold itself into a ring of smoke and green. I remember being on a small motorboat and looking back at the black smudge of Henderson and thinking that the fire looked like a wound on the face of the world. Men who had been enemies sat in the squeeze of a boat and said little. When the boats came alongside the ship, someone on the deck shouted orders, and a paper list was read off like a rosary, names that would be placed into forms and stamped by hands that did not know, and in the dry bureaucracy, the night would become numbers. Back aboard ship, they gave us blankets and water, and there were doctors who examined wounds and bandaged them in the professional way of people paid to make certain pains manageable. We slept in the uneasy way of men who think sleep may be a trick. At some hour, in the middle of a sailor's dream of home, a clerk below decks started to stack a thin pile of papers, logs and casualty lists, the kind of things that make war legible to those who remain far away. I was wide awake when one of the Americans, grieving and polite, took the pile and read a paragraph aloud. Night attack on garrison. Enemy infiltration. Losses approximately 200. Actions under review. He paused, and his fingers smoothed the paper, as if to erase the way something in the night shape would break the neatness of the sentence.
I did not speak. I had no language available that would pull the jag of truth from that flatness.
In the days that followed, the official machinery did what it always does at the edges of confusion. It built a wall of words. Internal memos moved up channels. Engineers wrote reports that read like the notes of men trying to keep leads under their pens. Histories would later show only what those histories were allowed to show. There were, in that post-evacuation scramble, gestures toward candor before cover tightened. I remember one of the engineers, a man with hands that trembled from too many nights at too many machines, folding a small sheet and tucking it into my palm as if giving me a prayer. He said nothing. I opened it later under a lamp and read what he had written in cramped pencil, an attempt by a man with a conscience to set a truth on paper. The sheet said in English and in hastily written Japanese beneath, Radar log Henderson Field, 0305 AUG 1942, 0312-0547, no returns. Spectrum smear recorded coincident with ground events. Logs flagged as sensitive operational loss. Recommend engineering follow-up. Recommendation, limit public notice, cause panic if widely known. Beneath those lines, someone had drawn a long, jagged line and then a thick black stroke that pulled a curtain across the bottom half of the page. Later, when I asked to see the official copies, I was shown a version that read shorter. Night action, enemy infiltration, losses recorded, engineering inspected, no hardware failure found. The phrase, no hardware failure found, was an invitation to complacency. The engineering paper that had hinted at a smear across the spectrum, the thin page given to me in secret, had been gone from the file. Where it had been, there was only a note in a different hand. Sensitive operational loss, details redacted. It is easy, when you pass time and move behind other men who write then retire, to think that such erasures are the product of a neat mind counting for secrecy. I think now that such changes are habit. When the inconvenient intrudes upon the neat, a line is drawn and ink covers where explanation might force panic or reveal a weakness. Sensitive operational loss is, as a phrase, meant to hold the shape of something larger than language should contain. I have kept some of those scraps. They are not proof in the court of men who ask for receipts. They are memory given form. They are the thin things left to those who would be unheard. In the months after our evacuation, men were sent to other islands, to hospitals, to long lists of duties that would keep them away from those nights. Ito was reassigned to a coastal battery, and Hayashi was posted to a map room far from jungle breath. I was given orders to report to a depot, and eventually found the small islands of Japan many years from that green fever. But the island did not release us cleanly.
Memories clung like tar, and the men who had survived carried in them that look of being seen by something older than war. Some of us drank. Others, like Hayashi, tried to reshape the night into lectures and old victories until he exhausted the language and took to nights of silence. Ito wrote letters that were blank except for small notes, names of men who had not come back. Sometimes at odd hours, I would wake and feel the weight of a club in the air, the sound of leaves being cut, and an old hunger for the names of those we had lost. Years later, when the war had become a geography taught in children's books, and the maps had been redrawn to keep men honest and safe, I heard rumor of inquiries. Men in suits would speak at desks and ask technicians whether the logs suggested any real failure. Men from some farther seat would decide whether a notation would damage morale. The truth, short, pungent, and impossible to fit to a schedule, found itself placed under an umbrella. I found, in the public archives available to a person without privilege, thin lines that spoke of night action and operational losses. If one stretched oneself into the fine language of bureaucracy, one could read no returns into a small hint of equipment intermittent. But the pages were not the same as the pages passed into my palm that night, and where the engineering notes had once been readable, the public copies had the clean dullness of redaction. I will put down now, as plainly as I can, some of the fragments and the papers that have made their way into what the men call the record. They are small and partial, and in places have been put into a shape meant to close the mouth of the matter. I give them here as simply as I can, because the truth survives in paper only when someone is willing to keep it. Classified memorandum, fictionalized representation. Henderson Field, Engineering, 03 AUG 1942, 0615. Radar receivers, Intermittent returns noted between 0312-0547. Observed spectrum anomaly described as non-atmospheric interference occupying broad band. Ground observations during interval report non-conventional tracks and multiple casualties. Recommendation: sensitive operational loss for command eyes only. Redacted. Further technical data, personnel IDs. There were other papers that echoed the same decision: to mark and to hide. A clerk wrote to a captain that the language used in messages to families should emphasize enemy action and heroic defense, and not to possible ecological hazard or unidentified large fauna. The reason was always the same: panic, confusion, and the very human need to keep the instrument that is war legible and coherent. To tell otherwise is to risk a different sort of chaos, and men in offices choose a kind of calm that looks like order. The classification settled in like a bruise.
For the military, it solved a problem: how to keep the war on a ledger without adding a new, terrifying line that might unsettle the logistics of an entire theater. For me, it offered a different wound: the death of truth outside a man's chest. Men could be given the consolation of neat phrases, while their reality was mangled. But a classification is not a silence that cannot be broken. It is a law of paper, not of memory. The survivors tell each other in the dark. The island whispers in ways men who listen learn to hear. In later years, when strangers would ask me for the story, I tried to tell it without the clean hands of a report writer. I told them of the smell that came before the giants, of how we tasted metal on our tongues like an omen when the first attack started, of the small kindness of the American lieutenant who gave his cigarette and did not ask what flag you flew. Some laughed, others asked too many questions in tones that suggested they kept other forms of proof. A few looked at me like a man asked to hand a relic. This is what I have lived with: the knowledge that during a window when the radar was silent, at least two forces, ours and the Americans at Henderson, saw the same blank in their instruments and later saw men vanish into the green. What U.S. forces uncovered during that silent radar outage was by the decision of men who wield pens and stamps, fit to be made an administrative problem and to be filed as an operational loss. The island still remembers. Kalani, the old islander, came to the shore many years after the ships had left and sat on the sand and watched the tide. He had not returned to the hills, and I think the island had not forgiven him for that. He spoke to me one afternoon with that same quiet I had first met, a voice small and slow as a tide. He said, "They keep the words, but the land does not keep their paper." I asked him about the tall ones, and he did not smirk as a man might when telling a lie. He simply said, "They are older than our fathers. They watch and make signs. They do not sleep when machines sleep." I have heard learned men try to explain such things since: atmospheric anomalies, electronic interference caused by bird migrations, the fallacy of men misreading their fright. Those explanations have a certain softness to them, and attempt to tuck fear into a coat so it cannot be seen. But those men did not feel the club swing. They did not learn the taste of hanging like a warning. There were consequences to the classification beyond the comfort of tidy history. Families received brief notices. Some families got no mention at all. The men who had served on both sides of the conflict, who had shared water and said their last words in odd mixtures of two tongues, were given lists that erased the day they had embraced beneath a ruined tent. That erasure was a slow theft. You can replace a man's name on a roster with a phrase, and in doing so you can make his death make sense to a machine. But paper and machines do not grieve, and someone must keep the grief from forgetting what did not fit tidy accounts. When I grew older and had hands that trembled like the palms of a man waiting on the tide, I made one small stubborn choice. I wrote this down, not as a complaint to government or a demand for redress, but as a human act. To write is to make a private thing public, to offer the bare things to daylight in the hope that someone will read them and understand that the night of that island was not a simple thing you can fold into a report. Sometimes I try to imagine what would have happened if the radar had not gone blank. If Henderson's operators had seen continuous returns, then the whole world of the night might have been laid out for a time, and names might not have been so easily smoothed. The machine would have borne witness for us. But the silence was a kind of mercy for those who wanted not to be seen. It let men call the attack a set of mistakes, or enemy action, or weather. That silence became the hinge by which the narrative would swing. Do not misunderstand me. I do not say in anger that the men who classified the papers were wicked in any simple way.
They were men with pens forced to weigh the lives of many, and sometimes the fewer spoken truths are the tools of decisions made with fear of a larger chaos. I only say this: in the quiet between the lines of their reports, there were ribs of truth they did not like to count, and so they drew a curtain. If you ask whether the giants remain, I will not tell you that they are gone. I will tell you what Kalani told me in the sand, that the island keeps what the men in tents tried to deny. If a man goes into the interior thinking only of maps and runways and the risk of an enemy behind a ridge, he will find other things that predate his maps. The island does not abide our squabbles. It holds in its green shapes older than flags. When I walk now to the shore and watch the tide, I sometimes talk aloud. I tell the names of men who did not come back. I say Ito and Hayashi and Sato and the freckled marine whose name I still cannot quite recall without choking on the sound. Speaking them gives them air. A man can be a number on a list, or he can be a voice in another man's mouth. I prefer the latter. The papers and official files will always have their line: operational loss, enemy action, night raid. Those words will be easy for men who must move on. But if you crack those forms open, you will find either a wall of ink or the thin thread of an engineer's note that insists on a smear across the frequencies. Let those who read this decide what they will do with that fact. I do not ask for apologies, nor for the tearing open of old wounds in the name of fame. I ask only that if you go near the green interior of such an island, you go with an understanding that some things on Earth resist tidy naming.
There is one more thing I must tell in the small hope of warding off other men. Do not enter the deep green as if it were a blank map. If the instruments go silent, do not assume silence is the same as safety. Instruments are eyes that sometimes tire when something takes its hand across the lens. If the radar goes quiet, look to human eyes, to what islanders whisper, and to what the ground says beneath your boots. Better still, listen to the old men who speak stones and names as if memory were a kind of weather. I am old, and my hands write slowly. Sometimes my pen shakes with other things than age. Sometimes I breathe and think the club lifts above the leaves. But I have a small piece. These pages will have my voice. They are not proof in a court of men, but they are the record of a man who kept watch and told the name of what he saw. If you have found these words, and they have made that green night real, then carry them with you in the way one carries a lamp, small, careful, and not to be waved like a banner. Tell the names, speak the times. If, in the future, a man hears of a silent outage and thinks it only a line in a log, remember that for 2 hours, people on both sides of a war looked at blank screens, and then at bodies hung in trees. Remember that where the instrument is quiet, something larger may be turning its head. I end as I began, not with proof, for I have none the world will grant me, but with a plea. If this account does anything, let it be that those men who were moved by a thing too old for our forms are not erased by a pen. Let the phrase sensitive operational loss not be the last thing that keeps them from being known. If you have felt this story reach you, if you want the small, fictionalized papers and the files that I have kept in the fold of this book to be seen and considered, not as evidence in a court, but as fragments of a human history, then keep this memory alive. Share it with someone who cares for the names of men and the shapes of places. There is one thing that redaction cannot eat: the voice of a man who remembers.